In one of the Trump administration's final acts, the United States has labeled Yemen's Houthi movement, or Ansarullah, as a foreign terrorist organization. This label has serious implications for a country that is already suffering greatly from years of war and genocide at the hands of the Saudi-led coalition supported by the West. I'm Richard Medhurst, and you're watching the Communiqué. Since 2015, Yemen has been gripped by war. The Houthi movement, also known as Ansarullah, has been fighting against the Yemeni government, backed by a Saudi-led coalition, which includes the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. The country has also been plagued by the presence of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which has taken advantage of the war-torn country to wreak havoc. It's important to note here that the Saudi-led coalition has enjoyed tremendous support from the West in its bombing campaign of Yemen. For many years, the United States has sold astronomical amounts of weaponry to the Saudi kingdom, effectively supporting its relentless bombing campaigns in Yemen after gaining air supremacy over the country. Since Barack Obama took office, in a series of deals, he has sold Saudi Arabia roughly $115 billion worth of weapons, including other military equipment and training. Over 40 different deals, including tanks, warships, helicopters, and much more. When Donald Trump took office after him, he not only maintained U.S. support for the war in Yemen, but also increased arms exports to Saudi Arabia. In 2017, Trump set up one of the largest arms deals in history, which over 10 years would amount to up to $350 billion in weapons for the Saudis. Even until the very last minute in December of 2020, Trump was still pushing arms deals to the Saudis as his term was about to end. The United Kingdom has also played its part in this terrible genocide. Weapons manufacturers like BAE Systems and Raytheon UK make bombs in the United Kingdom, which they then sell to Saudi Arabia to be used in Yemen. According to John Devereux, a former defense attaché to Saudi Arabia and Yemen, he said they couldn't do it without us, highlighting the instrumental role that Britain plays in fueling this genocide against the Yemeni people. The United Kingdom has also provided thousands of contractors who give in-country training to the Saudis. And as we recently learned, the UK has provided training to 100 Saudi Arabian pilots directly at Air Force bases inside of Great Britain. Simultaneously, France and Germany have also sold billions of weapons to the Saudi Arabian regime, raking in enormous sums and profiting off of the misery and destruction of Yemen. All of this combined has actually made Saudi Arabia the world's largest importer of weapons and, frankly speaking, the largest exporter of terrorism. Just from these bombs alone, thousands of civilians have already been killed. In one instance, 130 civilians were massacred in an airstrike while attending a wedding in 2015. Cluster bombs have continued to kill and maim innocent children. Human Rights Watch and other NGOs and relief agencies have noted the Saudi-led coalition's continued pattern in bombing fishing boats and fishing villages, which are civilian targets and constitute war crimes. In addition to weapon sales, we've also seen the U.S. intervene directly in the conflict, carrying out aerial bombardments and drone strikes. During his tenure, Obama was dubbed the drone striker-in-chief due to how many civilians were killed in his horrific drone program. At one point, he even ordered a drone strike which killed a U.S. citizen of Yemeni descent who was 16 years old. When pressed about the incident, his top advisor justified the killing by saying the boy should have had a more responsible father. Then when Donald Trump took over, he murdered the same boy's sister in another operation. Trump continued to support the war in Yemen, dropping even more bombs than Obama did during his time in office. This shows us that one feature all U.S. presidents seem to have in common is the disregard for human life and a love for the military-industrial complex. While a lot of the deaths in this conflict are the result of military operations, many of them have been the result of malnutrition, disease, and other preventable conditions, which makes it all the more heartbreaking. The United Nations warned that since the conflict broke out in 2015, conditions in the country have steadily collapsed, resulting in internal displacement, food insecurity, and cholera outbreaks. A report from the United Nations Humanitarian Office put Yemen's death toll at 233,000, mostly from indirect causes. According to the OCHA, the war had already caused an estimated 233,000 deaths, including 131,000 from indirect causes such as lack of food, health services, and infrastructure. Hostilities have directly caused tens of thousands of civilian casualties. Over 3,000 child deaths and over 5,000 children were verified in the first 5 years of the conflict, and 1,500 civilian casualties were reported in the first 9 months of 2020. The United Nations, as well as numerous NGOs and relief agencies, have described the crisis in Yemen as the worst humanitarian situation in the world. In July 2020, according to the International Committee of the Red Cross, almost 2/3 of Yemenis do not have food, and around the same amount have no health care. Equally, they warned that a majority of Yemenis are without clean water and 11% suffer from acute malnutrition. Already in 2017, it was noted that the cholera outbreak in Yemen was the largest ever recorded in history, with over 1 million cases. According to UNICEF, 12.2 million children are in need of humanitarian aid, and 24 million people are in need, but aid agencies can barely keep up, as their funding goals aren't being met. As a result of this, the United Nations had to shut down several essential clinics, with more at risk of being closed. Lisa Grande, humanitarian coordinator for Yemen, said in August 2020 that half of all the UN's major programs in Yemen are impacted by this lack of funding. Already 12 of the UN's 38 major programs are shut or drastically reduced. These last years of wars have taken a tremendous toll on the Yemeni population. The Bush administration destabilized the Middle East with its war on terror. Then Obama and Trump took over, lending their military and logistical support to the Saudi-led coalition, and even participating in this massacre of the Yemeni people. And on top of it all, what does the U.S. regime do? In his final days as Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo declares that he will be designating the Houthi movement as a foreign terrorist organization and specially designated global terrorist entity. This sadistic, cowardly move by the Trump regime received widespread condemnation from virtually everyone: NGOs, relief agencies, and even U.S. politicians. One statement from U.S. Senator Todd Young condemned the move, saying that with this designation, the world's worst man-made humanitarian disaster will go from bad to worse. Lives of innocent Yemenis and our own national security hangs in the balance. One of the relief agencies working in Yemen, Save the Children, made it clear that the U.S. terrorism designation threatens children's lives and places thousands of children at further risk of starvation and disease. With 80% of the Yemeni population living under Houthi territory, designating the Houthi government as a terrorist organization means that the overwhelming majority of Yemenis will suffer even more. These sanctions will make it harder to import food, medicine, and other critical supplies. Mark Lofcock, the United Nations Emergency Relief Coordinator, gave his comments on the situation in Yemen earlier this month and made very clear how sanctions would impact civilians, making it harder for them to buy food and further worsening the humanitarian situation, which is already in tatters.
That Yemen imports 90% of its food, and that nearly all that food is brought in through commercial channels. Aid agencies give people vouchers or cash to buy commercially imported food in the market. Aid agencies they simply cannot replace the commercial import system. Already, Yemenis are crowding into markets and shops to stockpile whatever they can afford. Families are terrified that no more food or other supplies will make it into the country. Some suppliers, banks, insurers, and shippers are ringing up their Yemeni partners and saying they now plan to walk away from Yemen altogether. What is the likely humanitarian impact? The answer is a large-scale famine on a scale that we have not seen for nearly 40 years.
Although the United States pretends that these sanctions will only affect a few individuals, this is simply not true. The reality is that sanctions dissuade third parties from engaging in trade and commerce with the entire country. People working in trade and finance and commerce will be more reluctant to do business with Yemen for fear of being fined or placed on a list by the U.S. Sanctions also make it much harder for Yemen to obtain foreign currency, most notably US dollars. And since roughly half of transactions in the world take place in dollars, this means being cut off from a very significant portion of the market. As Janti Sarepto, the president and CEO of Save the Children, says, with this new policy, the Trump administration has effectively prohibited certain interactions with the de facto authorities in the north. Many fear that businesses such as banks and shippers will avoid working in Yemen for fear of violating US law, resulting in widespread shortages of food, fuel, and other essential medicines. Yemen is a country that already imports most of its food, hence why it is vital for them to have access to foreign currencies and be able to do trade, especially when the majority of food doesn't come through aid or relief agencies. Although the United States claims its sanctions don't target humanitarian endeavors and outlines exemptions for relief, we know this simply doesn't translate into reality. In the case of Syria, for example, the United States said the same thing in its Caesar Act sanctions, and one can see how that's going. The currency's in free fall, the economy is plummeted, and people are forming bread lines, queuing up for hours every day in a country that was once self-sufficient and a net exporter of wheat. And even then, Syria, despite everything, was still in a somewhat slightly better position. Yemen is unfortunately not so lucky and has been neglected and forgotten by the world. We'll be right back after this short break. Joining me now to talk more is Rooney Agarhus, who's co-founder and general director of the Yemen Solidarity Council. It's good to have you on. Thanks for taking the time. So can I get your initial reaction to the United States designating Ansarullah, the Houthi movement, as a terrorist organization?
The designation is unfounded, based on a plenitude of immoral and false allegations that has been going around about the movement for at least the past 5-6 years, or even earlier on, like 10 years, that the movement is a quote-unquote Iranian proxy, which is totally unfounded and baseless, really, to be honest. We were expecting it, as were plenty of people. But it's still unfortunate, and it's sad that given the fact that all the implications and complications that the designation will make, it will only make things worse for 85% of the Yemeni population.
The Yemen Solidarity Council put out a statement saying it would be ceasing all operations in the U.S. and putting temporary hold on fundraising. How is this designation going to impact your work and humanitarian endeavors in Yemen?
Considering the fact that the Ansarullah, the popular liberation movement Ansarullah, is now on the U.S. foreign terrorist organization list, we cannot continue operating in the United States, specifically because we are in fact enjoying of a very intimate mutual relationship with the authorities in the Yemeni capital, Sana'a. So already there you could see complications with us doing any work in the United States, because we would be liable to prosecution.
In the statement that was released by Mike Pompeo, it says the United States will make an exemption for relief agencies and humanitarian work, but they said the same thing about Syria, and we know how that turned out. So do you think this exemption will actually translate into reality, especially given that most food in Yemen is imported?
That's a good question, actually. The Department of the Treasury recently released a bunch of documents detailing these exemptions. But we find them totally useless and doesn't correspond nor translate into reality, dealing with what is needed at the moment for the Yemeni people. So the exemptions are totally useless. We cannot possibly, as have the Red Cross and Save the Children and Doctors Without Borders have been criticizing the designation and the subsequent exemptions that have now been released and made public.
What do you expect to see from the Biden administration, given that Joe Biden has been inaugurated, his Secretary of State Blinken has been confirmed? They said that they would be reviewing this designation. Do you have any hope in regards to that being overturned, and how hard is it to actually get that removed?
The designation being overturned, simple as. That is all we are demanding, and that is all we are hoping for now, because, as I've mentioned previously, this designation is based on unfounded and false accusations made in a vague attempt to push hard against Iran. That was the Trump administration's policy. But all it did was pushing hard on suffering Yemeni people that are already starving and have been starving for the past 5 to 6 years. So definitely overturned this designation, and we are skeptical of if Biden really withdraw U.S. support from the Saudi American coalition, because undoubtedly the war was a Biden-Obama war to begin with. But for a start, I think overturning this designation would prove helpful and useful to the suffering poor of the Yemeni population.
Why is that? Why are we seeing such negligence and lack of attention from the international community towards Yemen?
I think it has a lot to do with the media neglect of the war, the lack of coverage, the lack of adequate coverage. That is very important. We have been hearing a lot about the Saudi American coalition, quote unquote, intervening in Yemen to at some point they make it seem like they're dropping bombs on Yemeni civilians, hospitals and weddings to save Yemen from this perceived ghost of Iranian influence, when in fact the Iranian influence in Yemen is so minimal. It's highly over-dramatized and exaggerated to a point of it becoming obscure and dumb, in lack of better word. The media organizations, the mainstream media conglomerates and corporations in the West have been not only failing to cover the war in Yemen from a somewhat objective standpoint, but they've also been getting a lot of or basing a lot of their coverage on Saudi-paid, Saudi-funded narratives that the majority of Yemeni people fundamentally disagree with. So it has a lot to do with the narratives being spun on the war, and there's a lot of false narratives, a lot of over-exaggerated narratives on the war currently.
In the statement from former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, he says that the United States has already given hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to the Yemeni people. I've also seen Saudi Arabia pledge some money. Isn't that a bit hypocritical when they're the ones bombing Yemen? What do you make of that?
I think it's called the KSA Relief have been funding and driven this huge PR stunt to really show the world how good-hearted people they are and how much they are helping, and not only that their military campaign is helping the Yemeni people, and their aid is helping the Yemeni people, and the US aid is also doing all sorts of stuff to help the starving poor of the Yemeni people. Fact of the matter is that the majority Yemeni population, that is 85%, they don't see just 1 centimeter, just 1 ounce of any of this aid that is supposedly being donated to them out of supposed goodwill and good-heartedness. A lot of the aid, a lot of the foreign aid is being donated to militia groups in occupied Aden and Hadramaut, and all other Yemeni or Saudi-occupied Yemeni regions. And most of these funds and most of the aid goes to with the warlords that have been terrorizing the local population for 6 years now in the occupied territories. Yemeni intelligence found huge weapon caches of foreign weapons and missile systems and rocket-propelled grenades bearing the USA logos. Meaning, of course, as concluded by the Yemeni intelligence director, that the USA claims to be giving humanitarian aid to the Yemeni people, while really funneling arms and money into known terrorist groups that have been blacklisted practically everywhere. So it's a farce. It's a way for the occupiers and the aggressors to say, we might be bombing your weddings, we might be destroying your homes, or bombing your funerals, or bombing your water sanitation systems, or bombing your critical infrastructure, or bombing your precious farms. But hey, we give you tons of money in aid and humanitarian donations. It doesn't add up, and any people with just the tiniest of peanut brains would understand that it doesn't make sense, and it's most likely a lie, a flat-out lie, to continue legitimizing military aggression on innocent people.
Thanks so much for coming on. It's a pleasure speaking with you.
It's a pleasure to be joining you.
The Biden administration has indicated that it would possibly review the terrorist designation. However, in order to remove it, this would be quite difficult for Biden, and his cabinet would have to make the case for the Houthi movement, something that doesn't seem too likely, in all honesty. However, we all know that if the U.S. is really bent on doing something, they'll get it done. If the Biden administration is prepared to see thousands of Yemenis dying of starvation, and they're okay with that, and don't do everything within their power to prevent it, then this will be an indictment on them. We shouldn't forget that this conflict began during the Obama years when Biden was vice president. He, along with many members of his cabinet, who were also in government at the time, must be held accountable for this. For them to come around now after all these years and pretend to care is not something I really believe, nor have they really expressed any real remorse or commitment to ending support for Saudi Arabia and helping the Yemeni people rebuild. Just to give you one example, Avril Haines, who Biden appointed as National Director of Intelligence, she used to be the Deputy Director of the CIA under Obama. She also helped author the legal framework for Obama's drone program, killing scores of civilians, many of them in Yemen. It is truly imperative that something be done about this situation in Yemen. Not only has the United States and its allies sold weapons to Saudi Arabia and helped them commit genocide in Yemen, but the U.S. has really put the final nail in the coffin with this latest terrorist designation. This move accomplishes absolutely nothing except inflicting more suffering on the Yemeni people. It is a cruel, sadistic move, and typical for someone like Mike Pompeo, who spent the majority of his time as Secretary of State slapping Iran, Syria, and Venezuela with more sanctions than one can fathom as part of Trump's maximum pressure campaign, which, again, accomplishes nothing and only ends up inflicting immeasurable suffering on the innocent all over the world. The war in Yemen and the humanitarian crisis that has come about as a result of this armed conflict is an indictment on all the countries who supported this Saudi-led genocide. What does it say about the world if we allow this to continue? It is really difficult to encapsulate just how horrified and disgusted I am by this war and the humanitarian situation that has ensued. The hands of the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Canada, they are covered in blood. What is happening in Yemen is absolutely disgraceful, and we must never forget the leaders who enabled and fueled this disaster, and equally, those who stood idly by and did nothing when they could and should have. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Richard Medhurst, and this is the Communiqué.